Hi, this is Benjamin Percy. I'm the author of The Ninth Metal, and I write Wolverine and X-Force for Marvel Comics. And this is Spoiler Country.
In a world of podcasts, one rises in the night to destroy them all. The elder god in an ocean of noise, the Cthulhu of the airwaves. This is Spoiler Country.
Hello, listeners of Spoiler Country. Today on the show, you have a personal favorite of mine, Mr. Benjamin Percy. How's it going, sir?
It's going great. Thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, it's definitely my pleasure. I'm a big fan of yours. I'm a fan of yours with Wolverine. Your book, The Ninth Metal, is fantastic. I really enjoyed reading it. It's a nice, quick, perfect read for us. For me and my wife read it as well. So what I usually start off with all my writing guests from, I always ask first, where does your love of writing come from?
Well, I grew up an obsessive reader, and I know this sounds a little romantic to say, but just about every evening growing up when my family was not watching Star Trek The Next Generation or Kung Fu The Legend Continues, we were all sprawled out in the living room with books in hand. And my dad would be reading a science fiction novel, and my mom would be reading a Western novel. And my sister, the black sheep of the family, would be reading, a book on physics or something. And I would be reading either a comic book, might have been, EC Comics, those reprints that I was obsessed with, Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, or it might have been, The Wheel of Time, or an Agatha Christie novel, or a Stephen King or Dean Koontz, or who knows what. But it was always like a mass market paperback with an embossed title. And, I moved around quite a bit. And that had something to do with it, maybe, always being in a new environment, not necessarily fully fitting in. And escapism was, a welcome retreat. So was the fact that I grew up often and lived in rural areas. I didn't have neighbors I could hang out with. So when you're on 27 acres of land, outside of Eugene, Oregon, or around whatever it was, 10 acres of land, of scrubland outside Bend and Redmond, Oregon, I would retreat down the rabbit hole and turn pages so swiftly they made a breeze on my face. And and that was formative to my imagination. So reading books about dragons, about vampires, about robots with laser eyes, about barbarians with woolly underpants. Genre was where I went, to play. And the same can be said, as a teenager, when I started to scribble out stories of my own, I was emulating those who came before me. And it wasn't as though it was immediately crystallized in my mind that I would become a writer. I grew up around ranchers and loggers and didn't meet a writer until I was in college, but I had fantasies in mind. I wanted to be Indiana Jones. My parents are obsessive archaeologists and hobby archaeologists and rock hounds, fossil hunters. And we were always out in the scablands of Oregon, digging up fossils, visiting archaeological sites. And then I went on my own to be on several digs with the University of Oregon and with the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, sort of training for a path in that field, and ultimately decided that, it wasn't for me. I was living a life of the mind all along. Like what I had in my head wasn't the same as what awaited me in reality. So I was, in a way, that was training ground for me being a novelist. There was no Ark of the Covenant waiting out there for me. There were no Nazis to do battle with, or beautiful women. Certainly there were no women. It was just, scraping through inch after inch of soil. And the highlight of the day was discovering a bone chip. And so, I kind of eventually was able to, and a few different things contributed to this, but eventually sort of train my sights on, building worlds of my own and becoming becoming a short story writer, a novelist, eventually a comics writer and screenwriter as well.
I really like the picture that you drew of, or described, of you and your family sitting around reading books together. It's one of those things that you don't seem to hear as much, but it sounds like it's great to hear that it was your family that got you into reading like that. It was a fundamental aspect of your childhood.
Yeah. And I mean, there were always books in our hands. There was always a book in, the bathroom, in the kitchen, in the car, in a backpack, in a back pocket. If you're waiting in a long line, you read a book. If you're on a road trip, you read a book. If you're lounging around late at night, you read a book. And that sort of engagement and conversation that came from, not just the study of craft, but, the different tropes of the genres we were exploring, like that was just part of our vocabulary. We could talk, those who were members of the Fellowship of the Ring, or those who were, crew members of the Starship Enterprise. We could talk about them with the same familiarity that we might have some of our, cousins or uncles. So yeah, that's the world I grew up in, and it was training ground for where I've ended up.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. And you grew up in Oregon, but you chose to attend Brown University. So what was your goal in attending Brown, which is literally on the other side of the country?
I had no plan. I had no goal. It was pretty random. My science teacher, David Bermudez, he taught a number of science courses, including AP Physics and that I had taken. And I thought he was a really cool guy, and he had gone to Brown. And so that was the school I applied to. I applied early decision, and I got in, and I never applied anywhere else. And I had never visited college campuses. I didn't really know much of what was going on, what to expect. It was a solid educational experience. I don't think it was the right school for me necessarily. And it was certainly quite a lot of culture shock from going from rural Oregon to the urban East Coast and the Ivy League crowd. To give you an example of this, on the first day that I arrived, I walked into my dorm wearing Wrangler jeans and shit kickers. And my roommate, who I am friends with to this day, but his response to seeing me as I entered the room was, "Oh my God, I'm rooming with a hick."
Nice introduction.
Yeah. And I struggled for the first year. I ended up on academic probation, actually. But, I found my focus, and it wasn't just emotional focus. It was also academic focus. I'd come into the school with an anthropology major and decided I didn't want to do that, and changed over to creative writing. And part of that was, something that's happened to me over and over in my career, in my life. And that is, I faced rejection and I found a way to pivot out of it. So I sat down with my advisor in my spring semester, because I was on academic probation. I failed a bunch of courses and gotten lousy grades in the ones that I did pass. And he was one of the professors who had failed me in computer science. And that was one of my issues at Brown, was that they didn't have any direction. Like, you normally go to a university and they have required courses. Brown doesn't have any required courses, which for an 18-year-old dumbass like me was not a good thing. I needed somebody to tell me, this is what you should take.
Yeah.
So I took a bunch of courses that were not right for me, including computer science, when I didn't know how to code. And anyways, I sat down with him, and he's like, and I asked him for advice, and he's like, not a lot of people have the guts to say this, but, college isn't for everybody. And he was basically telling me to drop out.
Yeah.
And I got up, and I obviously felt like a miserable smear of human waste.
Yeah.
And as I was leaving the office, he said, it's kind of surprising you're doing so poorly, because your application essay is the best I've ever read. And that stuck with me. I never saw him again. I never spoke to him again. But that line stuck with me. That summer I ended up working at Glacier National Park, and I was going through, I guess, a bit of an existential crisis. I was thinking about dropping out. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. But that line, that my application essay was the best he had ever read, like, that's when I first started to keep a journal. That's when I first started to just snatches of stories and poems and songs even. And I met a woman that summer. I was the gardener at Glacier National Park. I know that's kind of a weird job at a national park, but I was the gardener.
Yeah.
And she was a waitress at Many Glacier Lodge. You know, I would write her these love poems and love letters. And she said, one night we were watching the sunset over the Rockies, and she was like, "You should be a writer." And I was like, "Okay." And I came back that next semester and changed my major to English, and I started taking creative writing classes and, you know, really buckled down. I ended up graduating with honors, which, you know, was a big screw you to that initial advice.
It's funny, the power of a woman to convince you to do something. Just
indeed. And you know, I ended up marrying her.
Oh.
So it was a fateful summer in many ways.
That's such a cool story. When I went to college the first time around, I was an anthropologist major as well. The first time around, I went and I actually kind of focused on primatology, and I did that for a few years until I quit. But it's kind of funny how many people start in the anthropology field and never do anything with it ever, later in their life, which is kind of funny.
Do they all want to be Indiana Jones, I wonder?
You know what? I think that they don't properly tell you that the fantasy of what it sounds like you're going to be doing is close to the reality of what you really are. Right. I think it's always the problem.
I mean, I still have that fedora in my office that I got when I was a teenager.
Oh, you actually had one.
I wonder how many people's lives Indiana Jones ruined.
Oh, I'm sure there's quite a few people who realize, oh, that's not what you do. There really isn't the mystical artifact you're going to find in a cave somewhere. You're going to be digging in a ditch somewhere really hot and humid.
Indeed. But the only thing that was true was snakes. There were a lot of snakes.
Really?
I was on one dig. Actually, this is a scouting expedition with the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, and we would be going up and down all these canyons and discovering rock art sites and GPSing them in and then mapping them out and such. And yeah, that was a summer of almost getting bit by 30 rattlers. And I mean, it was like something out of a Cormac McCarthy novel after a while. Like, we'd be killing these snakes because we would have to, you know, be mapping out these sites, and I'd have like all these rattles attached to my belt.
Well, the important question is, though, the important question is, did you do the line, though? Did you do the Indiana Jones? Why did it have to be snakes? Did you do it when you were there?
Why did it have to be snakes? Asps, very dangerous. You go first, Indy.
Well, it's kind of great. I mean, obviously you found your calling when you became a writer, because you became extremely successful, not only as a novelist, but as a nonfiction writer as well. You wrote a work called Thrill Me, Essays on Fiction, and you also teach an online teaching course on writing suspense. So how has what you learned as a writer diverged from what you were taught about being a writer? Or did you find that what you were taught was pretty close to the reality of doing it?
So that online course you mentioned, it's just a one-time deal on Skillshare where I sat down for a day and I sort of unloaded all these different techniques for suspense, and you can just download that at any time if anybody's interested. But yeah, I also wrote this book, Thrill Me, which is about suspense. It's also about kind of that literary genre divide. It's my craft arsenal, and prior to publishing Thrill Me, I had taught as a professor for about 10 years.
Wow.
So that was my former life. I was a giant nerdy professor. And if I, retreat even further into the past to when I was a student, I walked into that first creative writing classroom and sat down, and I was ready to write those stories that I had told you about before. I was ready to write a werewolf story. I was ready to write a Conan story. I was ready to write a story about a mystical flaming sword or whatever. And the first thing that the professor did, and he looked like a mannequin, he was hairless and expressionless. The first thing that he did upon going through the syllabus was to say, "No genre." And I put up my hand, and he settled his dead gaze upon me and said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, what do you mean by this whole no genre thing?" And he said, "I mean, there dragons, no vampires, no robots with laser eyes, and especially no barbarians with woolly underpants. And I, sat there for a moment taking this in before putting up my hand once more and asking very earnestly, but what else is there? Because I really didn't know. I had never read or heard of Flannery O'Connor or Leslie Silko or James Baldwin or Alice Munro or any of the other literary writers that I fell in love with thereafter. And every classroom that I ended up in, year after year after year, I heard the same thing: no genre. And plot was a dirty word. Despite this, I never fell out of love with genre fiction. I fell in love with literary fiction. I never fell out of love with genre. And I eventually came to a place where I felt most drawn to the people who were doing both, in a way. If you think about what does literary fiction do really well? Literary fiction has characters so three-dimensional that they seem made of flesh and blood, not ink and paper. The sentences are exquisitely rendered. The metaphors glow. The themes are subterranean. What's the worst of literary fiction? Sometimes there's not a lot going on. But, you can level the similar criticisms at genre fiction. Genre fiction at its worst might have formulaic plots, might have paper-thin characters who are more types. It might have pedestrian prose. But the thing that even the worst of genre fiction never forgets is that stuff needs to happen. All six cylinders are always blazing in genre fiction. And so if you think about the best of both worlds, like converging, the best of literary fiction, the best of genre fiction, you have, stories written by the likes of Margaret Atwood, or Cormac McCarthy, or Dennis Lehane, or Ursula K. Le Guin, or Octavia Butler, or I could just keep going. And I wanted to be in a similar space. I wanted to write stories that were, that were artfully told but compulsively readable. And so that's also how I approached my teaching in the time that I was in the classroom. I would I realized that I had never been taught plot. I had never been taught structure, really. There was no, it was almost, it was frowned upon to even address that, as though your story was somehow lacking if it had a firm spine or any inkling of genre elements in it. So anyways, I tried to create not just my own storytelling arsenal, but also my own teaching toolbox. And a lot of that you'll find in that book, Thrill Me, which I wanted to make sure that I wrote before I quit teaching so that I could continue lighting some fires under some asses.
So why do you think genre fiction gets such a bad rap?
Let's be honest, genre fiction is the standard. If you go back through time, to when we were grunting around campfires, it's always been the adventure story, the ghost story, the monster story. But what happened in the mid-20th century with the rise of the MFA program and the academization of literature, a certain snobbery took hold, and people seem to believe and to claim that literary realism was the standard. It's not the standard at all. It's a blip on the radar. It's a genre of its own. So, and I think that kind of gatekeeping is, it's going away. The tide has shifted. I graduated from college 20 years ago. So as I oftentimes visit campuses a lot now, they'll fly me in and I'll run a workshop for some grad students and do a reading, or I'll go to a literary festival, and, or I'll teach at a place like the Breadloaf Writers Conference. And, because of writers like Karen Russell and Kevin Brockheimer and Michael Chabon and others, people, the taxonomy that used to lock people in place, the fences that were erected that, used to corral people into different corners. Like, I feel like some of that's being burned down, kicked down. and you see sort of, I'd say a different approach, and that approach sometimes is, or look at Colson Whitehead. Like, he puts out a book, Zone One. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He's considered, the great novelist of this time. He put out a zombie novel called Zone One. Just stuff like that keeps happening. And I think that ultimately what you have to do is look at just look around at great genre vehicles that exist right now. I just finished watching Mare of Easttown, for example. By all accounts, that's a police procedural. You've got the dead body, you've got the shifting set of subjects, the twists, the troubled detective at the heart of the story, and blah, 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 blah. But what you understand by the end of this tale is that, the genre conceit is just a way in. It's just a way to sort of crook your finger at the audience and say, come here, you'll probably like this. But by the end, it transcends genre. It's, ultimately that show, what it's about is not who done it. It's about trauma and how different people respond to and carry trauma and push past trauma. It's about family and community, and that's the ultimate takeaway. And so that's a perfect example of sort of what I'm talking about as being sort of neither fish nor fowl, both literary and genre. I'm not really interested in, the labels and all that. Like, I'm just interested in stories that thrill me and that move me.
Yeah, it does feel like a story that's meant to entertain is always seen as beneath a story maybe meant to, I don't know, inform on some level maybe, or on sort of some dramatic level. And I think stories that are meant to entertain, there's so many potential layers that are found in those stories that I think it's almost same thing with movies as well, like the Oscars or anything like that. I feel like they're always, once again, they're treated as secondary for some reason. And I never understood that. Yeah,
sometimes that happens. I mean, you look at Oscar season, right? That's a time of year.
Yeah.
In the fall, those movies start to come out. But you know what? Those movies are their own genre at this point.
Yeah.
And movies like The Dark Knight or Midsummer or whatever aren't nominated.
Exactly.
Even though they're, tremendously artful in the way that they were written and produced.
I agree with you 100%. You also honestly are, like I said, you mentioned earlier, you're a very successful comic book writer. You're a very successful novelist. Are the skills to be a good comic book writer and a good novelist the same? Do they diverge in a certain area? Or can you train for them the same way?
No, they require different skill sets for sure. I mean, there's certain crossover elements, but that applies to any storytelling medium. There's always fundamentals that they share in common, but writing comics is a strict form. It's 20 pages. It's 5 to 7 scenes. There's usually a splash page in the first 5 pages. There's usually a splash page in the last 3 pages. You have an A plot, a B plot, a C plot, and a D plot, and the B plot of issue 1 becomes the A plot of issue 2, and so forth. So, there's generally a villain who is a reflection of the core wounds of the character, of the hero. Blah, blah, blah. I could keep going, but that Terrence Hayes is a poet, says that if you look at the difference between like free verse poetry and form poetry like a sonnet or a villanelle, he says, it's cool if you can break dance, but it's badass if you can break dance in a straitjacket. And comics writing, it's like breakdancing in a straitjacket. But that constraint can sometimes be inspiring, and it certainly makes you more efficient. You have to do a lot in very little space, and you have to sort of amplify common storytelling elements so that, comics are just sort of technicolor in every respect anyway, but so that you can convince people to come back a month later. I mean, it's just insane. If you think about if your favorite show came out once a month, right? That would drive you crazy. You'd probably lose interest.
Right.
And yet we're asking people once a month to hold on to that story in their heads and to drive to the comic shop and pick up their copy, that continues the story. It's just a crazy obligation. So you really have to just like crank up the volume as loud as you can to make sure that happens when it comes to audience loyalty and to fight attrition. But, I am a better novelist because I write comics. I know that. It's not just that my, newer novels are better because I've spent more time at the keyboard. It is that, and that I'm more mature, and that, I have more life experience, that I've read more books and everything. All that's true, but it's also because comics have just trained me to be that much more of an architect, to be that much more aware of the component parts of storytelling, because there's such a strict form.
But when you're going about writing your novels, do you think then in terms of like a comic book, I have to think of in these tight scenes, I need to build every scene to make sure that it kind of ends on that splash page, even though it's prose, but like a splash page idea that hooks them into the next chapter or
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you look at a comic book, right? And it's not just that final page, which is often a splash page. It's almost every scene has a cliffhanger, right? Here's Commissioner Gordon up on a rooftop, and he's talking to Batman, and then in the background behind them in the sky, a plane's going along and some missiles strike it.
Yeah.
The conversation's interrupted. End of scene. Something else happens in the next scene, like the Batmobile goes spiraling off a bridge. End of scene. You always are just ending in an addictive way, and you see the same thing in Law and Order episode, right? You move towards a commercial break, and the detective discovers the body in the alley. Their flashlight homes in on the face. And it's not just the dead body that's surprising, the discovery of a dead body. It's the star witness in the trial. Dun dun, Cialis commercial, right?
Yeah.
That's the commercial break. And in the same way, like with novels, yeah, and I discovered this not just from writing comics, but from breaking down books. I early on was just rereading and rereading books and blueprinting them and trying to figure them out. One that I did this for was The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, because everybody at the time was reading it. And it was this big brick of a book. And I was just trying to figure out, like, why are so many people reading this giant book so swiftly and calling it a thriller? When the form alone seems to indicate that it'll be a slog. And one of the things I did was I went through that book and I read it 3 times. And the third time I blueprinted it and I stuck all these different colored sticky notes in it to mark different cliffhangers and trouble points. And one of the things that I discovered was that here you have Mikhail Blomkvist, the troubled journalist. Here you have Elizabeth Salander, the troubled hacker. Each of them have like 4 or 5 things. Mikhail Blomkvist, he's got legal problems. He's got professional problems. He's got romantic problems. He's got familiar problems, and he's got serial killer problems. Right? For each one of those things, I would have a different sticky note. Maybe it was like a periwinkle blue sticky note for, I don't know, his professional troubles. Maybe it was a pink sticky note for his romantic troubles. I'd stick it in the book every time I saw this thing come up. And I did the same thing for Elizabeth Salander. She's got a whole host of problems. She'd get her own sticky notes. And what I discovered was that it was like almost every 25 pages, 25 to 35 pages, there'd be this rotation that occurred, where it's like you'd go from one problem and it would spike, and it would usually spike right at the end of a chapter. And then the next thing would come into rotation and spike, usually right at the end of a chapter. And I came to think of this as the dance of the flaming chainsaws. And, in the way that you compose a novel is not to create, if you conclude things in a chapter, if you think about a chapter almost like a short story and you bring up trouble and resolve trouble in that chapter, you failed, because you've created a start, stop rhythm. Or instead you want to rise towards some moment of emotional or physical peril, and then cut away and not resolve that thing for a while. And then you just constantly have this dance of the flaming chainsaws. Just imagine these chainsaws like roaring towards you, and then you somehow manage to flip it into the air again, but you only have a second to think about it, because here comes another before the other will come back down again, and so on and so forth. And this is really evident in the way that if you're reading comics, if you're writing comics, this is, explicitly obvious in comics in a way that it's not always done in novels. But I sort of took that skill set and I apply it to everything that I write now.
Yeah. And in reading your newest novel, The Ninth Meadow, which, like I said, was fantastic, you have multiple different characters, each one, as you said about Joshua, too, kind of cycling through issues. And you do have that cliffhanger ending at each chapter. So that's based on what you were discovering, and not only reading comic books, but also things like the girl with the dragon tattoo.
Sure, yeah, and if you think about some of the characters in that story and the way in which I was sort of designing their narrative arc and their emotional arc, in comic books, you have a hero who has a core wound, right? Spider-Man exists because Uncle Ben was shot by a burglar. Batman exists because Bruce Wayne was walking with Thomas and Martha Wayne from the theater through Crime Alley when they were set upon by robbers, and gunshots fire and pearls and blood splatter the street, and we have our origin story. So there's this core wound, right? And then and what you typically have happen is that the character is motivated by, driven by that core wound, and that whatever villainous or antagonistic forces that they're wrestling with are an externalization of that core wound, and or of the many splintered weaknesses inside of them. So Batman's like a really obvious example of this with his rogues gallery. You can look at each of them and see them as reflections of some sort of internal problem that Bruce has. If it's a Joker story, it's directly tied to that Crime Alley moment, because out of that comes Batman's want for law and order. His want to fight chaos. Chaos is epitomized in the Joker. You look at Two-Face. If it's a Two-Face story, every Two-Face story should be about, is Bruce Wayne the man and Batman the mask, or is Batman the real man and Bruce Wayne the mask? If it's a Freeze story, that should be about Bruce's internal coldness. If it's about a Scarecrow story, it's about that boy who was afraid. That boy who was afraid, who grew up to be the one who weaponized fear. That's what every Scarecrow story should be about, right? So in the same way, if you look at my book, I've got all these characters in the Ninth Metal, and one of them, John Frontier, right? He's struggling with this core wound. Part of, it's not so simple as just one thing, but it sort of springs out of one thing, and that is he blames himself for his mother's death.
Yeah.
And out of that death came a lot of trauma and a lot of bad behavior that he's trying to rectify now, that he's trying to atone for now. And that drives his story. And he has a lot of secrets he carries around with him, so I won't go in too much, even though this is spoiler.
Right. I mean, well,
but then you have villains in the story who sort of they bring out these weaknesses. You have a character in the novel, Thaddeus Gunn, who wants to weaponize John, which is exactly what John does not want. His greatest fear is to become a weapon, because that's what what haunts him is the damage he's done already. So yeah, sort of very comic booky examples. You'll find their genesis, in me studying Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. You'll find them, sort of that DNA in the pages of this novel.
I mean, in many real ways, I mean, the origin of the character Hawkins, once again, is very classic comic book superhero, and in how his back. I'm not giving away too much of the story of what happens to his own family is kind of classic in that superhero trope as well. And his wish upon the meteor, which is make me stronger so I can fight him, is also, once again, it's very classic. And also, in my opinion, it also opens the door to so many other possibilities, because once again, he wishes upon the meteor. He gets a wish that comes true. Now the question is it coincidence, or is there a force that can enable the granting of wishes on some level? And I think that's also adds a very interesting layer to your book as well, that I think exists from the Hawkins character, who's also very broken.
The character who's weak, who's broken, who becomes strong, and the thing that he wished for ends up being a curse. That's a classic sort of turn, where the thing that you wish for ends up being the worst possible thing that could ever happen to you.
And without getting too, before we get too deep into the novel, because we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive for our listeners, can you give us your pitch on what the novel is about?
So it's a age-old sci-fi construct at a glance. A comet comes streaking through the solar system. The Earth spins through the debris field. we are introduced as a planet to unfamiliar elements off the periodic table that upend the laws of physics, biology, geology, that create chaos in the geopolitical theater. And what I was trying to do was create a trigger event for a new world within our world. And this is, you could say, if you think about it in Marvel or DC terms, this is a new dawn of heroes and villains.
Mm.
And what I was hoping to do was create, it's called the Comet Cycle. It's not a trilogy. I have 3 books, but it could be 6 books. It could be 9 books. It could keep going. It's supposed to be infinitely generative. What I wanted to do was create my own MC or DCU. You know, you look at comics, and one of the pleasures of reading them is that they are a shared universe. What happens in Wonder Woman carries over to Batman, carries over to Superman. There's that ripple effect. The same thing happens in literature, though, as well. Louise Erdrich has her own literary shared universe. Faulkner has his own literary shared universe. Stephen King has his own shared universe, especially as epitomized in the Dark Tower series, which really threads together everything philosophically, as well as, you know, in terms of the narrative threads all come together there. But that, yeah, I kind of wanted to create an amalgamation of that, what I learned from comic books, what I learned from literature in the Comet Cycle. And yeah, this first book takes place in Minnesota, northern Minnesota, and focuses on the metal. And if you think about Omnimetal as, you know, having cousins in the Marvel or DC universe, you could say, oh, that's some kind of like vibranium, or oh, that's kind of like adamantium or unobtainium or whatever. You know, it's a metal that is absorbent. It absorbs kinetic energy. And this changes everything for the weapons sector, for the energy sector. And as a result of that, people from all over the world, Saudis, Chinese, they all rush to the middle of nowhere, which becomes the center of everything. You know, you have roughnecks streaming in on trains. You have a rise in prostitution and drugs. There are bodies and shallow graves. It's a boom town equivalent to a kind of sci-fi Deadwood. And there's a family drama at the heart of it. And ultimately, it's less about these high concept elements that I'm discussing and more about the characters and how they handle wealth, you know, struggle to keep their moral compass in corrupt times.
And part of an element of the story that's very much its own character as well is Northfall, Minnesota. It's very much its own personality. And I know you're very familiar with Northfall, having spent some time living there. How similar is the novel's Northfall to the real Northfall, at least before the advent of Omnimet, which obviously changes the whole element of Northfall and makes it a very interesting amalgamation of what it could be?
Well, I mean, I made up the town of Northfall, but it's very similar to Ely, Minnesota. And it's, you know, I've spent a lot of time up north, and it's not only my favorite part of Minnesota, it's become one of my favorite parts of the country. You know, it's a liminal space in that you don't know sometimes what's Canada and what's the US. You don't know what's private or tribal. And there's a lot of wars going on over that. And it seemed to me, if you're talking about a cosmic event, something that's about a war of the worlds in a way, what better space as a backdrop than that? And also due to the fact that northern Minnesota used to be, with the Iron Range, the center of the steel industry. All this iron ore, all this taconite came out of northern Minnesota, was shipped to steel mills around the world. Like so many Rust Belt cities, Rust Belt areas in the Midwest, you know, that's experienced economic decline. Mining is still happening, not at the same rate. And there's a lot of discussion, a lot of very heated discussion going on as to whether the Boundary Waters area should be mined for copper nickel. And this debate, you know, hinges on whether it's more important to protect wilderness areas or whether it's more important to protect the economy, you know, help the industry of the area, the people of the area. And, you know, people come to fisticuffs over this stuff. And so I just thought, like, with this dramatic legacy already invested in that real estate, what a perfect place to drop this bomb blast on. And you have the people who populate the novel come from this from all sides. I have characters who are part of legacy families, legacy mining families who are trying to control everything. I have characters who are like wilderness guides who are trying to wish that things would go back to the way they were. I have people coming from outside the state and trying to sort of rapaciously, claim their stake and so on and so forth. So I have government agents who are running experiments and blah, 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 blah. I just have this swirl of perspectives that all comes together in this sort of fishbowl scenario in an area that otherwise would have been completely ignored.
And I really do love that you have that theme of how corporation, when they enter a small area, can take advantage of the resources there. And the part that actually popped in my head was actually similar to the idea of like fracking, what fracking does when corporations buy areas, and they do a lot of that, which can be dangerous to the area.
I was looking a lot at North Dakota and what had happened there. The Bakken oil formation just created this boom, this Wild West, nouveau Wild West, and thousands and thousands of people moved up there. And the motto of North Dakota for a while was $1 million a day. And struggling farmers would sell off the mineral rights to their land for millions. And, crime boomed. And I had my binoculars trained on North Dakota, and then I transposed that onto northern Minnesota.
And I think another interesting consequence of the arrival of the Omni Meadow are what you call the Meadow Eaters, which is a very cultish group. I kind of thought in my head a little bit of moments of like the Heaven's Gate, a little bit too, who believed the comet was coming. They were going to somehow, if they killed themselves, arrive on the comet, and it was going to be, I guess, like heaven. So tell me a little bit about the Meadow Eaters, because it kind of is an interesting idea that the moment something really spectacular like the Omni Meadow arrives, like that comet, immediately people's first, or at least a certain segment of people's first thought is create a religious theology around it somehow, which is kind of what the Meadow Eaters seem to do, as well as things such as they use as a drug as well. They crush it, I guess. I can't remember, you called it like stardust or something along those lines. The term for it. So tell me a little bit about the Meadow Eaters and what inspired their career, because they definitely feel like a very symbolic representation of a segment of people.
Sure. Well, we're always, all of us are looking for meaning in our lives. And when you look to the stars, right, that's where people typically, aim their prayers. You look to the cosmic as with sometimes as a forbidding, omnipotent presence. And whether it's the supernatural or the religious, there's a lot to be said about the unknown, that drives us to our knees and makes us ask for help, makes us ask for guidance. And I grew up around cults in a few different ways. One, I grew up in Central Oregon, not too far from the Rajneesh compound. If you're not familiar with the Rajneesh, they are documented in this series called Wild Wild West on Netflix. You should check out. So we used to go fossil hunting on the ranch, and so that was my backyard. So I was constantly aware of the Rajneesh and their troubled history. I was also aware of cults because I've got family members who were members of the Summit Lighthouse cult that was run by Elizabeth Prophet, and they believed the world was going to end, and they took over a bunch of caves in Montana and put ventilation systems through them and put all the ammo and food to last a lifetime, and they all went into the cave and waited out what they thought was going to be a nuclear holocaust that never came because cult 101, never give a deadline. So eventually everybody left the cave, and Elizabeth Prophet was busted for something. There was charges, I think, connected to gun running and racketeering or something like that. Anyways, I grew up around cults. I've always been fascinated by cults. I saw people giving up their bank accounts. I saw that firsthand. I saw people putting foil pyramids on their heads and chanting. That's not a joke. That actually happened. People who are blood relatives of me. So, I guess that's just in my hard wiring, and I've always wanted to write about it. And this seemed like a good opportunity for such. And yeah, there's there's something to be said, though, about how you can't write these people off because something is happening. Their eyes spark blue, when they smoke the stardust, and they seem to be in communion with something other, something connected to the comet's origin.
I really think, like what you said about the idea because you don't set a deadline. It's kind of interesting. What do cult people do when they realize the thing that they were thinking about as the deadline never happened? So they just move on to the next one, or
I think they usually create a new deadline. You see that with the QAnoners right now.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Always like, oh well, in March. Oh no, it's actually August, and I'm sure there'll be another deadline once August passes.
Yeah, and like I said, I think another thing I think you did fantastic with your book is that there's a certain the characters aren't, in many ways, would you say, pure good or evil. A lot of the characters have a lot going on with them that makes them very complex. For instance, you have like John the Frontier, who you think is a hero, but there's definitely other stuff going on. His family isn't the family you think he's going to. Pretty early on, you realize that there's something weird going on with them. The scientist with Hawkins as well. I mean, not a bad person, but she's definitely not doing something on the level as well. The only character that seemed early on that seems very positive 100% is Stacy, who it kind of feels like her optimism is, it's an interesting experiment what happens to someone in a world like that to an optimist. And I was wondering if that was kind of how you planted the characters to make sure that they were complex in that way.
Yeah, I mean every story is a transformation story. And each one of these characters goes through the gauntlet and emerges changed at the other side. I think you'll struggle to find a story where that's not the case. Maybe there are a few Chekhov stories that are 3 pages long where the character doesn't really change. And in a way, that's the point. But Dorothy at the beginning of A Wizard of Oz is singing, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. And by the end, she's clicking her heels together and saying, there's no place like home. She's gone from a dreamer to realist. And I think that that's a similar journey to what you see in Stacey Toll. She is described in the book as Pollyanna-ish. She's calls herself a peace officer instead of a police officer. She, wants the very best for her community, but she is going to have to sort of, she's going to have to pull down the blinds on that sunny disposition in order to survive in this world. And she's going to have to do some wrong to make some right. And yeah, all the characters occupy a kind of morally gray territory, and sometimes they're going from bad guy to good guy. Whereas Stacy's journey is more like going from pure lawful good to sort of like neutral good or something like that. If you're thinking about it in D&D terms, where she has to, sort of adjust her barometer.
Right. And I think another thing you do that, once again, is kind of an interesting twist is that another major conflict is between the Black Dog Energy Company and the Frontier family. And once again, early on in the story, someone who, like myself, is thinking, well, Frontier's a local group, the local family, so they're probably the good guys. And very quickly, you're like, oh, wait a second. There isn't necessarily when you're dealing with millionaires, money, corporation, they're not necessarily the good guys. And I thought that was a very interesting way to make the readers kind of wake up to the idea of what they would expect from the local business. The family business.
Like a Norwegian American mafia in
right.
the way I put it all together. And this, their company, I think it's called Aurora Metals. I came up with a few different names for it. So I don't know if I changed that to Northern Lights Mining or anyways, their local company, it's been there for generations and they're trying to control it all once again, this legacy family. But they're running into trouble, as you said, from outsiders like Black Dog Energy, which comes from Texas and has mines throughout the world and oil reserves throughout the world. And anyways, Black Dog, it's kind of like I'm playing a lot with Western motifs in this as well. I mean, you can call it sci-fi, but it's also like a lot of sci-fi have elements of a Western in it. And you've got this, Ronin coming into town. I guess you could say this gunfighter coming into town, which is a common entry point for Westerns. That's John Frontier. Even the name of the family, Frontier, hints towards the Western. And then you have, let's say the ruthless cattle baron or the crooked sheriff. That's kind of the equivalent of the black dog energy. And so there's this battle for turf. In the end, neither's fully good or fully bad. You're going to root for the frontiers because you know them best. And by the end, the ship might have been righted. There's a character who sort of inherits it all that seems to be interested in doing the right thing more than others. But yeah, it's, and it comes back to comic books again in a way. I'm just talking about, here's the influence of sci-fi, here's the influence of crime, here's the influence of Westerns, but here's the influence of comic books as well. And that oftentimes what you see is in villains and heroes, villains are oftentimes either a dark mirror or an opposite of your hero. And so, Zod is a dark mirror of Superman, and that he has the same origin. He's also a Kryptonian, but he has the same power set, but he uses his skills for evil. Hey, are you back?
Yeah, sorry about that. So I guess somehow I always have my computer plugged in when I do these interviews. And for some reason, I guess the connection at the wire was unplugged. So it literally shut me down. So I just had to plug it in real fast. Sorry about that. That was not very professional.
No problem. I don't know where I was before.
We were introducing comic books and talking about how and villains being
mirrors.
Yeah, dark mirrors.
Yeah, so you have Talia Frontier, who's the muscle of the Frontier family. She's taking people out with baseball bats and fisticuffs. And then you have the muscle of the other family company, Mickey Golden, who, is putting people in headlocks and trying to steal land out from under them. And if they don't comply, you might have a dead dog on your doorstep, or he might pay you a visit in the middle of the night with a knife in hand. So, I have these two characters playing off each other. And all throughout the book, there are these different examples of dark mirrors. And sometimes it's a struggle to know which one of them to root for.
And especially because I think we naturally do lean towards the family and the local group as thinking they're going to be your good guy because they're local. But I like that you play on that and say, well, that's not necessarily true. Everyone has their own goals. Everyone has their own pursuits. And not everyone's going to be, and the assumptions that are tied to locality is not necessarily going to be a good guess on your part. You know what I'm
saying? Indeed. It's a lawless frontier and troubles afoot. So yeah, even by the end, I think that as things reorient themselves, as the story stabilizes itself, I close off some of the threads, I open up others, but it's, what I'm trying to do towards the end is to create a new sort of family. There's all these broken pieces, and they sort of fit together as a new family, as some of them ride off into the sunset and others ride into trouble.
And as you said, this is a series of books. So when is the next book in the series expected to be released?
So I took a cue from comic books again, not just regarding the content, but regarding the marketing and release schedule. And with novels, I see it as problematic that they come out as $36 hardbacks, $27 hardbacks. That just feels really exclusionary to me. If I'm somebody who's inside the industry, who's a giant nerdy reader, and I hesitate to buy a hardback, like, how do other people feel?
Right.
You look at comics, by contrast, they come out as $2.99 floppies, $3.99 floppies. And you have cheap wide distribution. You have word of mouth, and it builds. And then maybe people pick up the trade, right? The $10 trade. And then maybe people pick up a year later the hardcover. And then maybe people pick up 3 years later the omnibus deluxe edition. And that seems to me the right rollout, right? In a way that invites people in. And in the same way, you go to a movie and they drop $7 or whatever. Later on, I might buy that deluxe Blu-ray if I really love the movie with the director's cut and deleted scenes and everything. I might buy that. I wouldn't buy it up front without having seen the film. You want to play to collectors when you think about these hardback editions. So I am having this come out as a quick succession, as a series of paperbacks. And then later on, we'll have a deluxe hardcover edition with, some illustrations and extra stories and stuff like that. So they wouldn't publish the first book till the second book was done. Second book comes out in January.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And then the third book's supposed to come out next June.
So, good. So this isn't like a George R.R. Martin situation where like 10 years later, we're like, where's the damn sequel? Where's the next book?
No, the whole idea behind this was that it was just that it would build enthusiasm and excitement and sort of be a constant part of conversation because it would be rolling out continuously.
Well, I want to, like I said, the first book I think is fantastic. I look forward to the second book coming out, you said in January. And
That's right, yeah.
it was a great joy to talk to you, sir. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
All right, definitely my pleasure.
Spaghetti! And we're back.
That's right. We are back. Back in the saddle again. Well, I hope you guys really, really enjoyed that as much as we did making it for you. And if you liked what you heard and you want to hear more, you got to go check out spoilerverse.com, because at spoilerverse.com, we have a plethora amazing directors and artists of all walks of life, and editors and writers, and oh my God, are you a lover of comic books like we are? Then there's so many amazing people from the comic book world over at spoilerverse.com, and I highly implore you to go there and check it out.
Yeah, and while you're there, you can check out all the other podcasts on our network, like Bridges and Geekdoms and Funny Book Forensics and Haphazard Adventures and Nerds from the Crypt and so many more.
Misery
We put out
Point Radio.
episodes all the time. Go check all of them out. And check out all of the reviews and previews and articles we have going up every single day for you. Every day on spoilerverse.com for you to check out, to read, and to love, and to like, and to comment. We have a store link. You want to help support the site? You can do it two ways. One, go to our Patreon, which is patreon.com/spoilercountry, or go to our store link in the middle of the site there and get a t-shirt, a face mask, a hoodie, something, look fly as hell, and help support the site when you do that, because we get $1 or $2. And, maybe you want to talk to us. If you do, you can do it obviously on all the socials, but if you go to scpod.us/discord, you can join our public Discord server and come chat with us all day long.
I couldn't say it better myself, dude.
There you go.
You just mouthed out a ton of information at once, and really, I hope you guys enjoy what you're hearing, because we're working our butts off to bring it to you.
We are.
I guess there's only one left thing. One left thing? Yeah, I'm going to go with it. There's only one left thing left to do.
What's that?
In an oceans of podcasts,
We are Cthulhu.
as Cthulhu compels you to
Spaghetti. Open the mind.
and read more.
Spaghetti. Spaghetti. And we're back.
That's right. We are back. Back in the saddle again. Well, I hope you guys really, really enjoyed that as much as we did making it for you. And if you liked what you heard and you want to hear more, you got to go check out spoilerverse.com, because at spoilerverse.com, we have a plethora amazing directors and artists of all walks of life, and editors and writers, and oh my God, are you a lover of comic books like we are? Then there's so many amazing people from the comic book world over at spoilerverse.com, and I highly implore you to go there and check it out.
Yeah, and while you're there, you can check out all the other podcasts on our network, like Bridges and Geekdoms and Funny Book Forensics and Haphazard Adventures and Nerds from the Crypt and so many more.
Misery
We put out
Point Radio.
episodes all the time. Go check all of them out. And check out all of the reviews and previews and articles we have going up every single day for you. Every day on spoilerverse.com for you to check out, to read, and to love, and to like, and to comment. We have a store link. If you want to help support the site, you can do it two ways. One, go to our Patreon, which is patreon.com/spoilercountry, or go to our store link in the middle of the site there and get a t-shirt, a face mask, a hoodie, something, look fly as hell, and help support the site when you do that, because we get $1 or $2. And, maybe you want to talk to us. If you do, you can do it obviously on all the socials, but if you go to scpod.us/discord, you can join our public Discord server and come chat with us all day long.
I couldn't say it better myself, dude.
There you go.
You just mouthed out a ton of information at once. And really, I hope you guys enjoy what you're hearing, because we're working our butts off to bring it to you.
We are.
I guess there's only one left thing. Yeah, I'm going to go with it. There's only one thing left to do.
What's that?
In an oceans of podcasts,
We are Cthulhu.
as Cthulhu compels you to
Open the mind.
and read more.
Spaghetti.